Right now, there's a fascinating, invisible, and honestly relentless battle going on inside your head every single day. On one side, you've got your deepest, oldest biological impulses. On the other side, there's your modern, sophisticated self-control. It's basically a biological tug-of-war, and it dictates everything from what you decide to eat for lunch to exactly how you spend your hard-earned money. So let's look at the science of why our brains do what they do.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Picture a situation we've practically all been in. You've just spent an hour navigating crowded supermarket aisles, you've successfully picked out the healthy vegetables, you've compared the prices on pasta sauce, you've made dozens of tiny, responsible choices. And then you finally get to the checkout line. Staring right at you are the candy bars. Why is it that, in that exact specific moment, the sweet reward of sugar feels absolutely irresistible and your sensible shopping strategy just completely goes out the window? Well, to understand that, we need to look under the hood.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the brain's tug-of-war. Second, inside your reward system. Third, wanting versus liking. Fourth, the drain of decision fatigue. Fifth, impulses, biases, and behavior. And finally, number 6, a self-fulfilling prophecy. All right, kicking things off with section 1, the brain's tug-of-war. This is the internal battle between motivation and willpower.
Think of your brain like a car. Your reward system, that's the engine. From an evolutionary standpoint, the survival of our species literally depends on us maximizing our contact with things that are good for us: food, sex, social connection. The engine powerfully drives us toward those things. But in our modern world, we can't just act on every single impulse, right? That's where the brakes come in. Your executive function, which is primarily located in your prefrontal cortex, uses willpower to hit the brakes and make sensible trade-offs. But here's the catch. As we're going to see, the engine has limitless fuel, but those brakes, they slowly wear out over time. Moving on to section 2, inside your reward system. Let's dig into the biology of desire.
So what exactly is the reward system? At its core, it's a group of neural structures formerly known as the mesocortical limbic circuit, and it's responsible for 3 main things. First, incentive salience, which is just a fancy term for the sheer motivation or wanting of a reward. Second, associative learning, which conditions us to repeat certain behaviors. And third, positively balanced emotions like joy or euphoria. This whole system evolved specifically to increase our adaptive fitness. Put simply, it rewards you for doing things that keep you alive.
Let's actually trace the neuroanatomy of a rewarding moment. Step 1 starts deep in the brain in the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. When you encounter something rewarding, the VTA acts like a chemical factory, releasing a huge surge of dopamine. Step 2, that dopamine signal travels to the striatum, specifically to a region called the nucleus accumbens. This area is broadly involved in acquiring learned behavior in response to whatever that rewarding cue was. Finally, step 3. The signal projects out to the prefrontal cortex. This is the highly sophisticated part of your brain that mediates the importance or salience of the stimulus and attempts to govern your decision-making and behavior. That brings us to section 3, wanting versus liking. This covers the fascinating incentive sensitization theory. Now, what's really interesting about the incentive sensitization theory, introduced by researchers Terry Robinson and Kent Burridge, is how it splits the whole concept of reward into 2 totally distinct psychological components. Normally, we just assume that if we want something, it's because we like it. But biologically speaking, that's just not true. Wanting is the incentive salience, the craving, driven by those dopaminergic pathways we just talked about. But liking is the actual subjective pleasure or joy, and that's controlled by entirely different systems in the brain, including opiate and GABA hedonic hotspots. Why does this matter? Because wanting acts as a really powerful motivational magnet. You can neurologically, even compulsively, want a reward, like that sugary snack, even if you no longer actually derive any pleasure or liking from it. The engine just keeps running, even when the joy is completely gone. Let's look at section 4, the drain of decision fatigue. This is where we see the brakes starting to wear out. So here is the core vulnerability in our cognitive system. Decision fatigue is defined as the deteriorating quality of decisions made by an individual after a long session of decision-making. And it's super important to note that this is very different from general mental fatigue, like when you're just tired from multitasking all day. Decision fatigue is an unconscious psychobiological process that specifically arises from sustained decisional load. It's the direct symptom of what psychologists call ego depletion. When your brain enters a state of decision fatigue, a few very specific behavioral attributes begin to manifest. First up, you experience a massive reluctance to make trade-offs. Weighing pros and cons burns a tremendous amount of mental energy. Second, you start engaging in decision avoidance, which basically means you just accept the default or the status quo option because it's easier. Third, you suffer from impaired self-regulation, meaning your willpower to resist impulses completely plummets. And finally, you start relying heavily on cognitive shortcuts and biases instead of using critical thinking. Exhausted brains simply choose the path of least resistance. Which leads perfectly into Section 5, impulses, biases, and behavior. Let's look at the real-world consequences of all this. We can finally answer our supermarket question. In step 1, the shopper spends the entire trip making difficult, energy-consuming trade-offs about prices, nutrition, and budget. In step 2, this sustained load massively drains their cognitive resources, plunging them straight into decision fatigue. By the time they reach step 3, the checkout counter, their self-regulation is severely impaired. The dopaminergic wanting engine sees the Skittles and Mars bars, and the cognitive brakes are simply too worn out to stop the impulse purchase. Supermarkets literally design their layouts around your brain's ego depletion. Pretty wild, right? And it's not just about $2 candy bars. It happens with huge purchases too. Consider this quote from the literature. Decision fatigue helps explain why ordinarily sensible people can't resist the dealer's offer to rust-proof their new car. Researchers at Stanford University showed how decision fatigue leaves consumers incredibly vulnerable to timed sales strategies. After agonizing over financing, colors, and trim levels, your brain just avoids further trade-offs and says yes to the super expensive default warranty add-ons. Now, some people are actually super aware of this phenomenon and actively build their lives around it. Consider major public figures like former President Barack Obama, Apple co-founder Steve Jobs, and Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Despite their drastically different fields, they share a very specific behavioral trait. They became famous for reducing their everyday clothing down to just 1 or 2 identical outfits. This wasn't some kind of fashion statement. It was a deliberate biological strategy to conserve their limited daily mental energy. By eliminating the morning decision of what to wear, they effectively saved their cognitive brakes for the high-stakes decisions they had to make later in the day. But when the stakes are high, the consequences of decision fatigue are, frankly, staggering. Look at this massive drop, 65 down to 0. A famous study out of Columbia Business School analyzed the rulings of judges on parole boards. They found that at the beginning of a session, the percentage of favorable parole rulings was around 65%. But as the session dragged on and the judges suffered decision fatigue, that number dropped gradually to nearly 0. The judges unconsciously defaulted to the easiest, safest option, denying parole, because their exhausted brains relied on biased assumptions rather than doing the hard cognitive work of evaluating each case. After taking a break to rest and eat, boom, the favorable rulings spiked right back up to 65%. And finally, Section 6, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Here is the plot twist in the science. So the crucial point here is that literally everything we just discussed about ego depletion, it's recently been heavily scrutinized. Modern psychology actually engaged in a massive replication effort across 23 different laboratories to confirm the ego depletion effect. The result? They did not find an effect significantly different from 0. This sent absolute shockwaves through the field. While the reward system's wanting engine is an undisputed neurobiological fact, the whole idea that willpower acts like a gas tank that reliably drains empty is now being fundamentally challenged. This brings us to a brilliant insight from Stanford University psychologist Carol Dweck. She states, people get fatigued or depleted after a taxing task only when they believe that willpower is a limited resource. She found that if subjects believed their self-control was infinite, they didn't show the same drops in performance at all. In many ways, ego depletion might actually be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your brakes only fail because you fundamentally believe they're designed to fail. Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative question to think about. Is your mental exhaustion at the end of the day a hard biological limit of your brain, or is it really just a state of mind? The next time you're standing at the supermarket checkout staring at that candy bar, remember the engine of your reward system is definitely revving, but your brakes, they might actually be a whole lot stronger than you think. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it helps you make some great choices today.